Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Herbal Hour. This week, we have an episode on the symbolism and metaphor in the Christian stories found in the Bible. We have with us longtime student of the Christian way, Jakob Schmidt. He's also a naturopathic medical student, one of my good colleague friends, and a student of global health. We're delving into some key biblical stories, such as Cain and Able, Adam and Eve, the crucifixion and resurrection of Christ, and trying to understand them in a deeper sense, in a metaphorical way, in a psychological way, and finding what lessons they have to teach us in our daily life. We're also delving into how a religious path can be a way to healing, and how religion is actually a key part of the healing process for many people. So just to start out, how did you get interested in studying Christianity?
So that's a long story, but the short version would be I was raised Christian. Had two parents that weren't always Christian but became so, and then they raised me in that kind of mindset. Went to church and all those things, Sunday schools and all that stuff. It was around 10 years old that I had my first either these stories are a bunch of bull crap or there's something to this. And so that's when I first decided to, for myself, follow. And I was like, I think I want to buy into this. I think I like this. And that was kind of funny because I asked to be saved for the next 4 nights, you do when you first, you're like, did that work? Is that it? Which is a misunderstanding of what it actually is. But it wasn't until I was 16. So really, really long story short, I had a lot of self-hatred. I almost committed suicide a few times.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah, kind of crazy.
You're one of the most cheerful people I know at this point.
Not at all.
That's kind of very unexpected.
Yeah, I really hid a lot of my self-hatred, and I think that's still a core false belief that I fall into, if that makes sense.
So you kind of got you went past your dark night of the soul, as they call it in the religious texts. Well,
yeah, and I was 16 years old when I really felt like I actually for the first time met Jesus. And I don't mean physically a vision but I realized, because we'll get into it, but the whole Christian Bible is about a relationship with Jesus. It's about this God actually wants a relationship with you. And so when I was 16, that's when I first experienced it. That 10 years old was I think I want to buy into this as something that's real and not something that's just bullcrap. And then the 16 years old was oh my gosh, I can actually have a relationship with God. And so that's when I I don't know, I guess you could say caught fire for the Spirit. And that's where things just turned and my self-hatred was just melted, and I felt a lot of love from the God, the Father, and Jesus, and I experienced what that was. And that became a passion. So it wasn't really this study of religion. And even as some people, I don't even tell them I'm a Christian, just because although I call myself a Christian, to some people Christian might mean Donald Trump, and to others it means Mother Teresa, and to others it means crusade. It just means so many different things. So although I identify as that, I don't know what that means when I say that to somebody. So I think I more accurately say I follow Jesus. I say Christian, but it just, again, I don't know what that means to people. So but I believe in Jesus. I believe he was the Son of God. I believe in his teachings, and I follow after him.
Yeah, we were talking before about all of these biblical stories. We got in pretty in depth, and I'd like to talk about a lot of these different ones. But I think this is a great place to talk about the death, the resurrection of Jesus Christ, how it applies to our lives, how it applies to healing, because this is, as I was telling you, the time of the year where astrologically the sun kind of stays in the same spot across the sky. It goes to its lowest point for 3 days from December 22nd to December 25th, and then it rises up. So obviously early biblical writers, they were well versed in astrology and understood the relation of the stars and the divine. So there's many myths and many traditions that hold this time to be particularly meaningful for human life. We're going into the darkest time of the year, the coldest time, the most desolate time, the time when depression is at its peak, seasonal
Especially
affective disorder. In Portland, I mean, we have that all winter,
vitamin
but
D,
especially I actually started, not to get too off rail, but I started taking vitamin D, and I noticed it helped so much. It's one of the first times I took a supplement where I was this is life-changing. But anyway, back to it. Tell us about the story of Jesus.
Wow, yeah, okay. Yeah. So another big question, which any story we get into will be a good, big question. And specifically, I'll try to focus in, and you can help hone me in, because you and I can both rabbit trail. We're kind of like the dog and up.
Well,
squirrel,
we're both
like
Sagittarius, so both a philosopher.
Always going. So I'll try to tie it into like how it relates to health and healing. And I really think that this is like at the center of everything, because it heals this. You know, I get my identity from God, because he created me and he knows it. And so it's not like he withholds it from me, but he's the only one who can truly tell me. I can like kind of explore and find out this relates, like, you know, you tune in and you're like, okay, that's like me. And like, I tried this, but it's not really me. You know, you can tune into those things, but God like knows it intimately and can be like, this is true about you. And this is true about you. And as humans, we definitely tend to be like, oh, I'm bad at this. I'm not good at that. I'm like terrible at this. And it's really interesting. I'm already derailing, but I'm going to tie it back. It's really interesting when you first introduce people to listen to the voice of God, because I really believe all of us can hear the voice of God, not necessarily audibly, but there's like almost like the internal voice, and different from like conscience, and different from like, I don't know, evil thoughts, or different from other things. I think we all have that like tune-in ability. And when you first get people to like listen to God, and you ask them, you like lead them to listen to God and be like, what does God say about you? It's so interesting how so many people you'll get a somewhat response, like they'll be, if their eyes are closed or something, they'll be just like shaking their head or something, like they don't believe the goodness that God is speaking over them, because God is constantly, you know, I mentioned this to you earlier. It's the three questions of what do you think of yourself? What do you think of God? And most importantly, what do you think God thinks of you? And a lot of religion is like, we need to appease God and make him happy, or we need to do something right, and then we'll be good. And that's what the law was. But Jesus comes and he does the opposite. Jesus is like, I've created you. I've made you in my image. I've made you good. And let me tell you about who you really are. And so when you hear that, that's like, even I was on the mental health shift with one of the doctors at our school, and a lot of these people, you know, we see crazy things, we see depression, we see a lot of stuff, and I think that all those are important to address, whether it's with drugs or supplements or diet or whatever it is. But a lot of people, like I'm noticing, and it's different as a secondary because you're not in the main role, but a lot of people, you're like, you just hate yourself. Like I'm just seeing that. I'm like, you just honestly aren't. You know, you have internal conflict. And so the type of healing that I think comes from Jesus is that. It's that deeper, like, and it's not just loving yourself, because I think that's like strong, but when God loves you, and when you see that, and not this blanket statement, God loves everybody, which is true, but when you realize that God doesn't just love everybody, God loves you. He knows you. He knows the hairs on your heads. He knows the thoughts that you think. He knows you intimately. He knows your emotions. He knows that, and he loves you. And when you feel loved in that sense, you know, it's the difference between somebody got you a gift that was beautiful and well thought of, and somebody getting a gift that was specifically like, I've watched you and I've seen you and I know that you like this kind of thing and I got it for you. And that speaks more of like, oh, you like know me. And you love me, and that's different. So all of that's like what Jesus gets to, and what Jesus, the death and resurrection, the best part of that is my favorite part is the resurrection, because the death is like the end of the law. It's the end of us trying to fix ourselves. That's the key thing. Like it's the end of Adam and Eve in the garden is what God created. That gets messed up. God like creates this whole system to like try to allow man to fix themselves. They can't, and he knows they can't. So he's like letting them have their try. And then they keep doing that, and you just see that through the whole Bible. I think the Bible tells one story. And then it gets to Jesus, and God's like, I'm going to do it for you. I'm going to fix it. I'm going to free you from the things you really, truly want freedom from. And I'm going to continue to give that to you unconditionally. So that's what Jesus does. And the death is putting all that in the ground. It's taking all of our sins, all of our struggles, and giving this freedom. It's not about, Christianity has made it about getting into heaven when you die, but it's actually getting into heaven now. Like heaven's here. And Jesus talks about that. He's not like, wait till you die. It's all about then, which a lot of religious people think it's all about the death, but it's not. Like Jesus is like, it's about today. Like he's like, the kingdom of heaven is here. He says that like all the time. He's like, it's coming now. And so it's about like entering into his kingdom now, where there's freedom and he reigns. And it's a life to Jesus is a complete, utter surrender to God. And it's trusting him, which is hard. which is the hardest part. You're like, I don't want to. That's Adam and Eve. They chose to the tree of the knowledge. It's interesting. The tree isn't just like an apple or fruit or whatever it was. It was the knowledge of good and evil. And so Adam and Eve, and that's the one thing God's like, you can have this whole garden. It's all yours. Don't eat that tree. And Adam and Eve go with the serpent. There's a whole story there. That's a long thing. But Adam and Eve go, we want to decide what's right and wrong. And so back to today, that's the same thing. Jesus is like, let me be the one to decide right and wrong, and I will let you flourish. I will give. I just want to give to you. I just want to give. I want to give. And Adam and Eve are like, well, we want to do that ourselves. So that's the same human condition. Like, we want to decide. And so there's this fear. Like, I don't want to give over to Jesus. I'm afraid to give him my life choices, my decision makings, I want to control that, right? But what Jesus does in his death and resurrection is he like redeems it all. And he's like, if you trust me, like I'll give you like everything. Like by following Jesus, you give up everything. But in return, you truly get everything.
How does following in religious teachings help you in the healing journey?
Wow, that's a big question too.
How do you apply your views of Christianity, the biblical stories, and actually bring that into people's lives through, natural medicine?
Yeah. So I think getting back to that, like kind of what I mentioned with being on the mental health shift and noticing some people just like don't like themselves or they doubt things about themselves. I think one thing that, I think each of us are like individual and unique. And I think one thing that I think one of the things that God has put inside me is to see the like good in people. I really see, like when I look at people, I really see like the beauty that's in them and like the uniqueness. And I think God's just made me like an encourager. So taking both those, like, what do I know about Jesus and in hand with like who has he created me to be, like I can only operate out of like my identity, like we talked about junk earlier, and doing what you're supposed to, like doing what you were made to rather than what you weren't. Is like if I can tune into those things and get to the real issue and be like, like I could give you this medication for your depression and stuff, and maybe we start with that, maybe we start with fish oils or whatever, whatever it is we go for, or homeopathy or whatever, is I can also tune into that like space and like encourage people and challenge them in a way that's like, why do you think these things about yourself, or maybe not even assume that they do, but like be poking at that and being like, how do you like what's your, one thing is like asking about the religion. Do they have one? Do they have community? Do they have aspects of their life where they're like surrounded by people? And then what is that like? Is it oppressive? Is it very like rigorous and not helpful for them? Some people like the rigor, they like the structure, they like this is when I get up, this is when I do this is when I pray. And some people that like brings them life. So tuning into that, like, is this bringing you life, despite what the religion is, or is it like causing detriment for your soul? But specifically applying Jesus to people is that same freedom that Jesus has given me. And that same like thing that I mentioned earlier that I think God can speak to all people is tuning into that. Is like getting in and being like, dude, you don't even realize how incredible you are. Like you are like a very unique, intentionally made person that is special. Like those kind of aspects that you get.
My phone's just making all sorts of noises, listening to us.
It's like, yeah.
So we were talking before about the healing at Bethesda, I believe it's called, and how Jesus found like a crippled man, and there was these healing waters that you can bring someone into, and God would, bring healing, bring you back to life. But this crippled man could not actually get to the waters, and he kind of helped him over into those healing waters to heal him. But he did it on the Sabbath, which was kind of breaking a religious tradition, a kind of human law of you're not supposed to work on this day. And we were talking before about how that's symbolic of doing what is right, doing what is, the path of the spirit, in spite of what may be the customs or the laws of the time. What do you think about that as far as his message of, doing the right thing?
Yeah. Well, I think what it really is like, because Jesus also encompasses, is God in the flesh. And Jesus has this relationship with God, and he is God. So that's a whole nother topic. But he's constantly showing people who God really is. And I think that's the key part. And he doesn't necessarily he doesn't actually pick up the man and put him in the water. What he does is he just heals him on the spot. He's like, get up and walk. The guy can't walk, and he's like, okay, if you can't walk, just stand up and walk. We don't need the waters. We don't need this. And then he gets up and he's like, take your mat and go home. And that was breaking the Sabbath. He's like walking. I think the Sabbath, like, they added laws to it. So God said, don't do any work on the Sabbath. And then a lot of like Jewish religious leaders at the time just added a bunch to the law. And so they made things like, you can only take so many steps. You can only do so many of this and so many of that. And you have to do, so there's like actual like particular laws, which wasn't what God put in. So what Jesus is doing, again, back to like Jesus is reflecting the heart and the character of God. And it's interesting, a lot of Jesus's miracles he does specifically on the Sabbath, which is really interesting. And I think he does that intentionally. But that's mainly the ones that are recorded that we know about. Is then the religious leaders see the man walking. They're like, what the heck are you doing? This is the Sabbath. You can't do that. And the guy's like, well, he healed me and he told me to. And they get mad and like, who is this person? Like, we need to go find him and like shame him or whatever it is, you know? And then that's where Jesus has that like line. And I don't know if it's specifically Bethesda, but on one of those Sabbath healings that he does, he has the line that's like, man wasn't made for the Sabbath, but the Sabbath for man. And that's showing that what Jesus is doing is showing the intent of God. That God's not about this, like, you need to follow the Sabbath because it's the good thing. But he's actually like, you're like my interest, and I've created the Sabbath because I know in your life you're going to have, I mean, just think about today. It's too easy to like always be answering an email or always be on call or always be doing something, always like work. And we glorify that. You know, we really glorify this fast-paced system, and everybody's like, we need to rest, but nobody does.
It brings up an interesting point that there's essentially two kinds of laws. There's divine law, or you can call it natural law, and then there's like the law that man created to kind of approximate that law, right? So when he says the law is made for man, not man for the law, it's kind of like revolutionizing that idea of if a custom does not actually help people, you know, heal or make them closer with spirit, then it's actually should be disobeyed. So it's interesting that the early naturopaths, if you read any of their works, they're very keen on talking about natural laws and getting back to nature and how there's, you know, unseen ways of living, like having fresh water, having sunlight, living in the open, wearing light clothing, all these eating like foods from their state of nature. They talk very much about how if you follow the natural laws, the ones that man didn't actually make as laws, that's the path to healing. And much of naturopathy is this idea that there's a natural way of living, and it's something that we discover. And it's something that our laws, customs, and culture don't necessarily portray, hence why we have, you know, so many issues with people not having meaning in their lives, not having fulfillment, not being healthy, chronically ill, depression, anxiety. If you go into the forest for like a day, all that goes away, right? So it's like this idea that there's like a fundamental way of living that is deeper. You were speaking previously about how the story of Adam and Eve is crucial to an understanding of Christianity. So how does that story go? Lay it down for us.
Adam and Eve is one of my favorites, other than the stories of Jesus, because Jesus is just full of life and love and beauty. Adam and Eve is interesting just because so much is in it. There's God's intent in it. There's the separation of man from animals. There's God sharing power with man, which is different than a lot of stories. There's the origin of sin, or like which sin is like a religious term, but it really just means origin of wrongdoings, I guess. There's actually three different types of, there's transgressions, there's sin, and then there's, I forget the last one. Anyways, that's off topic. There's origin of that. There's the origin of like, there's like the, what do you call it? The human condition in it. There's pain and death. There's beauty. There's paradise. There's so much. So what, like, the basic Again, you can have a whole podcast on just each individual of those. And every time I read this story, I learn another thing. You also hear you also hear man get a false identity. You hear man get an identity from something else. And there's this line, I think it's in Genesis 3 something. This is after Adam and Eve had eaten the fruit. And God, well, actually, let me back up because I don't want to skip to that yet. So basically, God creates Adam and Eve. He creates the world, and he's like, something's missing. I need relationship. I was made, like, I'm a being of relationship. And so he created man. And then it's cool because he creates Adam, which whether that's literal or not, but he creates man. And then he lets man, he's like, oh, it's not good for man to be alone. And so he's like, I'm going to make him a helper. But first, before he makes him a helper, he brings all these animals to him first so that the man can really learn. He like tests out all the things and really learn, no, I really actually need somebody of my own flesh and blood. I don't need. And it's kind of funny how, see, there's another story. I've officiated a wedding, and I've talked about how that story relates to a man and a woman. So there's that in there. But so God creates this relationship. He's like, I want this relationship. And I think that really reflects a lot of us. We were created for relationship with God and with each other. I think community is like, I think it's something that we don't ask enough about, especially in natural medicine. We should be asking a ton about where's your community, because we live in an age of social media. I'm off topic now, but like, we just live in an age that's we're incredibly lonely and we're connected to everybody, but not at all.
Not in a deep sense. So the basic story is man lives in some kind of paradise. There's no idea of good and evil. There's just life, natural living.
Yep.
There's
this relationship with God and the animals, and he's like there's this line in there. He says you can eat anything green, you can eat it. And I just imagine like just walking up and picking even a poisonous plant, and you could eat it at that time. I don't know if maybe the plants have changed, and it might just all just be literature anyway. But I just love that idea of just be full and be free. And it's so natural medicine. Be outside, put your fingers in the ground, get dirt, come be with me in the evening. He would walk with Adam and Eve in the garden every evening. And that was like the cool of the day, which is like the best part of the day, which is like that, like, it's still nice and light out, but it's not burning hot. And
it's interesting in that story. The command is you can eat from the tree of life, but don't eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And I think there's like a very deep metaphor in that. I think about that story very often. And I've studied a little bit of Buddhism, so it kind of like ties in there. So the idea is that when man eats of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, the world gets split into opposites. This is the beginning of duality.
Yeah.
Right after that eating, the way, God finds out that man has transgressed is that they were naked and ashamed. They covered themselves. So now there's some kind of inherent guilt about being who we are as, it's almost like our realization of we were first a kind of divine animals that were just flowing in life and living. And then we kind of turned inwards and said, oh, wait, this is wrong. That's wrong. It's also interesting that the tree of life, there's a passage in there, I forget where it is. It might be in Genesis, that the tree of life, all the leaves, and they were made for the healing of the people. Like there's this tree of life. You can eat of life. You can participate in life. Life is, divine. But once you start thinking of everything in dualistic terms, in terms of good and evil, that's where all suffering comes from. But it almost seems like you were saying the creation is kind of the whole story of the Bible in like a very short parable. It's like man had to learn about good and evil. It was like almost like that step was a necessary thing that had to happen. Even though it brought much suffering and destruction, it was necessary for humans to actually be moral. It was necessary for them to understand that there is good and evil. It's like out of the blissful ignorance. But the point, I think, is to get beyond that and to reconnect with the divine intentions, with the knowledge, with a more mature view of understanding that like you're not like innocent anymore, but you still choose like the good, even though like evil exists. You choose the good. And I think there's a key point to be made, and we can talk about the story Cain and Abel. It's like the original kind of like first evil.
Right. Murder.
Yeah.
First murder.
Exactly. Well, the story of Cain and Abel is particularly interesting because I know of it generally. Maybe you can talk in depth about the specifics of it. But Abel was kind of the good man, very successful, doing all the things that God wanted, and reaping all the benefits. Everyone loved him. And Cain is like struggling to find his place in the world, and he feels that he's like personally hated on by God and not given the same attention. He's kind of like in a family where there's two brothers, and one of the brothers gets all the attention, all the love. The other brother is always trying to catch up and always feeling like, he's not being appreciated. So he actually turns eventually, and in spite, commits the first like grave sin, which is murder, and splits off into this faction. But I think it talks about the foundation of evil, that much of evil actually, one, comes from disunity with spirit. So like not feeling that they're connected because they feel like, somebody feels like everything they do, nothing works out. They never get the appreciation. They put in all the work, but nothing comes of it. And them feeling kind of vengeful for it, like spiting life. So my idea of what evil is essentially, evil is all that is against life. It's destructive towards life. Good is everything that seeks to fulfill life and bring more life. Now, if someone becomes jaded by some terrible event, there's like essentially two paths I think you can take. One is like you learn some kind of lesson from it, and it makes you actually want to do good. The other is you become jaded and you think nothing's worth anything. It's like nihilistic. There's no meaning. There's no God. There's no reason to do good. So I might as well just destroy everything. And I might as well, I don't have to watch for my brother. Like my brother doesn't watch for me. This very very painful origin of evil. What details did I miss in the Cain and Abel story? Because I know there's plenty.
No, that was pretty good. The Cain and Abel is actually really short when you read the biblical story, and it's almost confusing. And I think the thing that a lot of people, myself included, that I haven't fully landed on, which is a great reason to talk about it, is that there's Cain and Abel, and both bring a so God still has the relationship with Adam and Eve. He's still like with them in flesh. And God comes, and Cain and Abel both bring their like portions they're kind of like, in a sense, their tithe. They're kind of like bringing their, Cain is a farmer, so he has like fruits and vegetables, and he brings those to the Lord. And he said, here's my fruits and vegetables. And Abel is a shepherd, shepherd. And so he brings his like first ewe or something like that. It was like a lamb or something like that. And God basically says Cain's sacrifice or gift was good, Abel's sacrifice or offering was good. Cain's offering wasn't good. It's basically what it says. And you kind of get confused. You're like,
why is this happening? Like, why is God choosing one over the other? And I wouldn't say it's super clear to the layman, I would say. When you know more of the background history and what's actually happening and what each represents, like there's a lot of Hebrew there, and like culturally, what do those mean, those kind of things. And I think as a layperson, the easiest thing to do is in Hebrews, which is a New Testament, the author of Hebrews refers back to it and says, by faith, Abel offered up a good sacrifice, whereas Cain didn't. And there's this faith aspect. There's this heart aspect. And God's not interested necessarily in the actual offering. Your fruit actually wasn't very much, and I like lamb more. It's not that. That's what's troubling, because when you first read it, you're like, why is God upset with Cain? Is it kind of the intention? Is it kind of
believe so
that Abel brought it forth to glorify life out of a good intention, whereas maybe Cain came at it more from like, what do I get from it? Right. And that's why he was so upset, is because I didn't get anything from it. Right. But that's the lesson,
but I didn't.
Sometimes when you're trying to do good to get some gain, you actually commit evil and you suffer from it. Right. So if you do a good act just for a selfish reason,
or for just to do the right thing. So again, this is how Adam and Eve connects to Jesus, because Jesus is all about faith, and he fulfills the law. Right now, before Jesus, like everything leading up to it, the law is the thing that governs you. And so it's all about doing right and wrong. So Cain's like, I did the right thing. I brought my fruit. I just did the thing I was required to do. Whereas Abel was like, it's not about what I do. This is back to the Sabbath. Sabbath, like, one was like, I didn't take as many steps as I was supposed to. I obeyed the laws. And the other one is thinking, no, this is actually like benefits my relationship with God and my family and people. And those are two different, they're doing the same thing. They're both obeying the law, but one is like using the law to like support life. And the other one is using the law to like do what's right. And that's what's beautiful, is Jesus fulfills the law and is like, stop getting so focused on the law, focus on relationship with me, and I will free you from the law, because the law brings about the awareness of sin, and I wouldn't have sinned had I not known about the law. But trying to fulfill the law, I can't. Oh man, I'm kind of sounding all over the board right now, but it's so interesting how it's the same thing, and that's what I love about it.
They're both doing the right thing, but maybe one is doing it for the right reasons, and another deeper thing, and the other is. And then when they feel like they did all the right things and still life punishes them, they feel like personally offended, and they feel like they don't learn a lesson from, well, maybe like I went about it the wrong way. They think life is actually fundamentally unfair, and God is unfair. So screw him. I'm going to do whatever I want, and I'm going to get what is mine through anything, through murder. So why do you think he actually commits the murder?
Abel is, well, because he's like, well, I did all the right things and I did it wrong, so F this, and Abel got it, and I think it's just like you said, instead of learning and being like, Abel, why don't you tell me why you did this? And Abel would be like, well, it's not about the actual sacrifice that you're giving to God. That's important, but that's not what it's about. It's about relationship. So he could have had this conversation, but instead Cain chooses instead his own. He's like, I did what I did and it didn't work, so F the system. And Abel has his way of doing things, but I don't want to learn Abel's way. I just want to like get rid of it. And so so what Cain chooses is enemy. Cain goes, Abel's my enemy. Abel did the good thing or whatever, and God loves Abel. So now, because God loves, again, what do you think of you? What do you think of God, and what God thinks of you? Cain is believing God hates me, which isn't what God does. God does not hate Cain, and Cain is going, God loves Abel. I'm going to kill Abel. And there's like this.
There's a key aspect there too. So Abel was kind of God's like favorite child. He kind of looked upon him and really loved him. So Cain, in a way, wanted to do the most spiteful thing directly against God. I'm going to kill your most prized possession, your most prized child, because you didn't view me. I just realized something kind of psychological about that story, going deeper into it, is when you see, there's basically two ways to view somebody who is very like successful and is doing things well and is well in the world. One is you become envious and you think like, what are they doing that I'm not doing? Like, screw them. Like, I'm going to spite them. I'm going to try to destroy them, rather than how can I learn from them? How can I learn from them and be good like them? So Cain had that choice. He saw his, elevated brother who was doing all the things and was getting all the love of God. Instead of being like, what is he doing that I'm not doing? Can he be a good role model for me? He thinks like, no, like this is unfair. He was kind of like envious of him, so he killed him. And it's kind of this idea of how, the term like hater is what that is, right? Somebody who like looks upon somebody's good place in life, and hates them for it, instead of rejoicing and being like, how can I share in that? And that's like a fundamental story, and it gives an explanation for the origin of murder too. Like, what is like the fundamental reason that people kill each other?
And that's what Jesus says. Jesus takes a lot of the laws and goes like, okay, it says you can't have adultery with any woman. Well, I'm telling you, if you look at a woman with adulterous eyes, you've committed adultery in your heart. So Jesus is like, it's about here. It's not about the law. It's about here. So same with murder. He's like, it says in the law, don't murder. But I'm telling you, if you have hatred towards your brother, you've already committed murder in your heart. So he's Jesus is trying to do this. So this is, again, it's the same thing. Cain is about the law. What is the right thing? What is the wrong thing? Abel's not about the law. Jesus is not about the law. He fulfills the law.
Fulfills the law, but does not follow it. His being is an expression of it.
But his being, the law is like an outflow of him, not the other way around. I think a lot of religions, and which is why rightfully so, a lot of people get really upset with religions, is because it's about the law, and God's not about the law. The law was like the the law was Adam and Eve chose to decide, we want to know what's right and wrong. We're going to make that decision, not God. We want to be the ones, so let's eat this fruit. Because that's what the enemy comes and he's like, oh, if you eat this fruit, God said you'll die, but you won't really die. Like, God lied to you. And so the first thing the enemy does is like, oh, you're not like God. The first thing that the enemy does is he challenges their identity. He's like, God knows that when you eat this fruit, you're going to become like him. But newsflash, they were already made in the image of God. That was their identity. Their identity was like God. But what the enemy is selling to them is you're not God. You're not like him. You're nowhere near him. And if you eat this fruit, then you'll become like him. So he's selling them a false identity. Even with them being naked, when God first comes back into the garden, after the first time they meet after the tree, they hide themselves from God. And when God finally finds them, he's like, why were you hiding? And they say, because we were naked and we were ashamed. And so God realizes at that point, like, you've eaten the fruit. But the first thing he says is, he goes, who told you you were naked? Who told you who you were? Who gave you this identity? Who told you you were this or that thing? And God's like, I told you who you were. I'm the one who made you beautiful as you are. And now you're believing this other thing because you've chosen another identity. You've chosen. So that, even tying this back into like the naturopathic thing and back to that like identity. And that's what I said at the beginning. Like, I get my identity from God, because when I find my identity in my successes, when I find it in my grades, when I find it in whatever it is outside of myself, what people think of me, the possessions I have, or it's just successes. Those are the three most common things that people find identity in. Those things are all outside of me.
And I think there's like a key lesson in that story too of there's this ancient idea of hubris, or like in Greek myth and the Greek gods, which is committing a sin against the gods or God by thinking you're greater than them rather than you're like them. So there's kind of the made in God's image, which is what we are. We're God-like, versus thinking there is no God, I am the God. And having this kind of, that's like the foundation of megalomania, basically. That's like when that idea completely takes possession of someone's minds, and they make the law. They decide what good and evil is. They have the knowledge, they have the power. So now there's no one ruling over them or telling them what's right and wrong. They're completely disconnected. They're the lawgiver. And then that's like a path to a lot of evil. I mean, if you look at, Nazi Germany, that's kind of what that is. Nazism was like fundamentally had religious overtones, a lot of them. And it was about like, we're the right ones, we make the rules, and everyone has to submit to them or else like you're out. This is like our, world.
Yeah, and that's the Adam and Eve, and that's the human condition part, is like we want to decide what's right and wrong. That's like the human condition, and we're not very good at it. We're pretty like bad at it. And that's the point, and that's the garden was like God saying, let me do that. Let me do that work. I'm good at that work, and I'll like pour out on you ignorance and bliss, and you'll live in this paradise with me in community.
Like trust in spirit, trust in divine, and live life, and don't try to, make it your way.
And that's back to the law again. And Jesus going back is like, I'm fulfilling the law. And it's all about, the New Testament is all about how the law is fulfilled by Jesus. And we are now in a new place where all of our righteousness and everything comes from just faith. It doesn't come from me like tithing or not doing this sin or not doing that thing or not. It's not that sin or murder doesn't matter. It's not that. But it's not about what Jesus flipped on its head. Was we made it about the tree of good and evil, the same thing you said, Nazi Germany, all these things. We've made it about a set of rules. And again, Jesus is like, this will serve you, and it's about me. And so what the New Testament is all about is righteousness comes from just faith in Jesus. It's just like doing this and being like, okay, I trust you. And then receiving from God his love, his beauty, his like how much he wants to pour out on you, and moving out of that and being able, moving out of that place of like who I am, rather than this love like, oh, I messed up this day, I got mad at my wife, I was an asshole in this. So now my identity that day is I'm an asshole, I failed at getting my homework done.
Identifying with good and evil. That's
See?
a problem.
And it's back to the law.
I'm either good or I'm evil, rather than like just I'm divine and I make mistakes, but
and
I
that's what God's like, I've made you good and there's nothing you can do to mess that up. So like, do you want to receive that or not?
What do you think about this aspect? So the serpent, which was later equated with Satan and the devil as time went on, in more ancient traditions, the serpent is actually the bearer of wisdom. So there's kind of this Christian motif of making the serpent actually the source of evil, whereas in other tradition, it's the source of wisdom. What do you think about that? Is that like, are they talking about a different thing? Because obviously serpents and snakes, if you look at myth of Asclepius, that was like the rod with the one snake on it. That's like the healing symbol, because they would have these sacred snakes in Asclepian temples, which were basically places where there was like kind of priest healers. They would have people come there, go to sleep, maybe ingest some kind of substances, and they would be seeking healing through their dreams. They would tell the priest their dream and when they awoke, and they would give them an interpretation for how they could heal. But they had these sacred snakes that were all going around, so they had a different view. So this is like, might be blasphemous from like a Christian perspective, but hear me out. We were talking about this before. What if the serpent is actually not evil? What if there's this view that even like Satan serves God, but does, even though unwillingly?
That's interesting.
Like even the adversary is serving humanity in some greater sense, because before, this is a key point to make about the Adam and Eve creation story, is before that transgression, there was no free will. Because if you could only do what's good, that means you don't choose the good. Is that really morality? Can somebody who's forced to do good be considered a good person? That's like the idea of doing good out of, because you have to, or out of weakness, rather than I have knowledge of what good and evil is, and I choose the good in spite of the fact that, there's this other path, which also has some power to it, obviously, with the Star Wars. Like the dark side is quite powerful, but because it doesn't care about morality. It is like, we use the most powerful force lightnings and things like that. But it's founded around these other emotions. But the Jedi seeks to choose the good, even though they're aware that there is this other side, this other power. But in the end, there's like this saying in, I forget which Star Wars, but that I think Yoda says it to actually Luke while he's training in that cave. He tells him, Luke basically asks, like, is the dark side like powerful? And Yoda's like, yes, it's powerful, but the light side is always more powerful in the end. So it's like, in the meanwhile, like tyrants and people who abuse power and commit evil acts, they seem to win. But when you look at history from a larger perspective, they lose tremendously. So it's like this kind of idea of like, you do what's good and what's right and just trust in it. And that's, I think that's the power of that story. There's a lot of other interesting motifs in there. The fact that Eve comes from the rib of Adam.
And that's,
what do you think about that part?
Well, that's interesting. I think we've turned it into rib. It actually, in the Hebrew, it says God takes from Adam's side. So the original Hebrew is actually, it's not a rib. We just use rib. I think the main thing that's important about that, literally or figuratively as literature, either way, it doesn't matter. I think the purpose of it, because when Adam goes into a sleep and then God takes from his side and creates Eve, and then Adam wakes up, the first thing Adam does is, he rejoices, and he says, bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh. And that's what's different than, like, God created him another human that is exactly like him. And the saints, obviously they're different. They're male and female, and they're two different people. But there's this, like, Adam went through all the animals, right? God says, oh, Adam's alone and he needs a partner. I'm a being of community, and I have Adam, but Adam also needs that. So he's like, I'm going to make him a helper. But before he does that, he brings all the animals to Adam. And Adam names all the animals, but Adam's like, there's not, like, none of these, like, really fit me. Like there's something like missing. And so that's when God puts him to sleep, takes from his side, makes Eve. So when Adam wakes up, he's like, I've seen all the other helpers. This is of myself. Which is interesting because it's the same thing that God did, right? God made man in his image.
Right, so it's like an image of an image.
Which is great.
The translation aside brings up an interesting psychological point. So Carl Jung talked about how the psyche is fundamentally split in people. There's like a masculine side and there's a feminine side. One side is identified with and the other is not, and it becomes kind of the anima or the animus, which is kind of the feminine or masculine counterpart to the conscious attitude or the conscious psyche. So that almost seems to be pointing towards like how like the psyche was like split or something in humans, not just like it's obviously portrayed in the world through the genders and the sexes, but also internally as like a psychological phenomena of like, this is the one side of me and it's actually also me and it's also from God. It's a part of myself, literally my side. It's like my half. It's like my other piece of myself that I need to understand myself. Yeah. So it's like actually an internal metaphor too.
That's cool.
That's always one of my favorite ones. Yeah, a lot of
dude, a lot of marriage will expose a lot in yourself.
Yeah,
it really will.
Can't hide.
No, you can't.
When you're that close, right?
You're like, you think you dealt with a lot of things, and then you're like, man, I'm a selfish asshole. Holy crap! Like you realize things that you have that reflection.
Right. You need to almost like have that relationship to understand what your dark aspects are, what your dark side is, so that you can.
A lot of that.
There's kind of towards the end of that story, after Adam and Eve are kind of cast out of the garden and made mortal and made to work and suffer. It says there's a passage where the gateway back to the Garden of Eden was blocked by a cherubim with a flaming sword. Yeah. What does that mean? That's very specific.
That's interesting, yeah. I never thought about what that symbolism is, other than it just seemed like, to me, that's a good question. I've never thought about that. To me, it just seemed like a very obvious, like, you're not coming back in. It's pretty obvious that there's what you've brought into the world is in conflict with what I created, talking to as if, not that I'm God, but like in this place of like, God's like, I created Adam and Eve. I created this garden that's beautiful and perfect and incredible. I created what life was meant to be. I created that. And what you have brought into this world with this fruit, the knowledge of good and evil, the things that you've brought with that sin can't exist in this garden. And so I have to block it off now for the sake of like protecting this space that he later brings us back. And then what he does is like that. So that space is guarded. And then through Jesus, we're let back in. So Jesus pays, he's like, first we go through the whole process of trying to get rid of that sin ourselves, and we're terrible at it. We fail, right and wrong. We're bad at it. And then so Jesus is like, I'll do it. I'll do the thing for you. And
there's a passage in the Bible that says, this is like a particularly like warrior aspect of Jesus coming out. He says, I don't come to bring peace to the earth. I come with a sword.
Yeah.
And I wonder if that's tying into the flaming sword.
Flaming sword. I never thought of that.
And I also just a possible interpretation, maybe the kind of mythological aspect of it is, when we were Adam and Eve, we existed almost in this like spiritual state, and we were cast out of this like holy garden, heaven, onto the earth. And the only way back to heaven or this other place is through death, is through the flaming sword. Yes. That we're actually completely barred from it, not like because we're punished, but because we as humans sought this experience on earth. Yeah. And the only way back is actually by not being mortal anymore. Yeah. Is by the flaming sword, is by death. Yeah. From some kind of angel of death, perhaps.
That's interesting because Jesus goes through death to make that transition. And then also when we get baptized, it's our representation of dying and coming back out of the waters, reborn. And then there's also the whole like rebirthing, that's like when you give your life to Jesus, you're like being rebirthed. And then Jesus talks to one of the religious leaders and talks about being reborn, how you need to die and be reborn. There's so much about that in the scriptures. Even like a seed, he's like, a seed goes into the ground and dies, and it has to die in order to be like rebirth, right? So like the seed comes off the tree and like goes into the ground.
So maybe that's what the flaming sword represents. It's not physical death. It's like some kind of psychological or spiritual revolution.
Die to the law.
Because it's not just like an actual sword. It's like some kind of flaming sword. It's some kind of like, you basically have to go through some kind of death and rebirth.
Yeah.
Maybe not literally. Maybe not, you don't actually have to die.
Well, Jesus did the literal part.
He did the literal
for
part.
us.
Yeah.
For everybody. That's the key part of it, is Jesus. And that's even, and there's so much we haven't even begun to touch with Adam and Eve. Is like God kills, sacrifices a lamb, which we are at time now.
All right. Well, we'll definitely have to do another episode, maybe a few more parts.
Yeah.
We got many to talk about. We still need to talk about Solomon, the Law of Moses, the Trinity, miracles of Jesus, Jonah and the whale, which we talked about a little bit before. We got plenty of stories to share and how they kind of relate to our lives metaphorically. And I think
in natural medicine.
Yeah, I think that's the big lesson, is whether or not someone is particularly religious or they believe in like a literal God, there's so much wisdom that you can get from the biblical stories and from myth, and apply them to your life, even if you don't believe that they actually historically happened. Like we were talking about before, it kind of doesn't matter. It's like, what do you make of the lesson that was given? Whether or not it actually happens does not actually affect our lives that much. Yeah. But what we do with it affects our lives.
Yeah.
Thank you for being on, sir.
Pleasure. Such a pleasure.
Awesome, bro.